Hi, this is Emily of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Dr. Mariah White, host of Your Life Matters, here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you are done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Your Life Matters, where we talk about dreaming big and dreaming bold to reach your wildest dreams in both your health and your happiness. A new show comes out every single Tuesday. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Your Life Matters. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy, as always, is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. There's no Y in the name, okay? We don't mess around with it, all right? We're gonna this podcast, before we get to the next thing, is brought to you by Public House Media. You can check them out on Facebook. You can also check them out at thephmedia.com. We're going to jump into our word of the week because it is a phenomenally good word of the week, as every single word of the week is phenomenal. The word of the week is "gugaw" because we need it. We need this word. What it means is exactly how it sounds. Gugaw, and this is a real word. Got it out of an actual paper dictionary because most of the time I look them up. But this time I actually got the word out of a paper dictionary, and I think that's going to be my method from here on out. I'm just going to flip open I have a monstrous blue dictionary. It's huge. It's the biggest dictionary in the world. Not the biggest, but it's pretty close. And I just flipped it open. I took some time to look. I didn't just flip it open and find something. I did take some time to look. But gugaw, you're going to add it to your vocabulary because it sounds like you're intelligent when you're using it. Actually, it sounds like a baby is making it up. It means something showy and useless, okay? So it's a trinket. You can actually, so that's a noun. The gugaw is a noun. It's like, oh, that gugaw there, makes sense, sounds good. We are going to get rid of that. I'm going to chuck it. I just threw it away. I had it on an index card, and it's gone now. We're going to jump into our accidental essence, and maybe I can turn this podcast episode around. Maybe after that word. I don't know. We'll see. All right. So as we've been going through them, this is the third week of my rules for writing. And if you haven't been following along, you can listen to the past weeks. I would suggest it because they go with the most important rules first. That's what I'm doing. The most important rules first to the least important rules. And as I have been stating in the last couple podcasts, and I'll just state it here again quickly, these rules are meant to be able to be applied to pretty much every writing situation you run into. Most rules that I run into are dumb. They're either not applicable to writing itself, like you can have somebody gives advice, there's a rule or there's advice, and the rule or advice is like, well, that's good life advice, but that's not specifically geared toward writing. So it might make you a better writer, but it makes you a better person in general. So these are actually specifically geared toward writing. These are meant to be applicable to all writing situations. It's not something that you can quickly say, oh, that's something that doesn't really make sense in all these situations. So the first two rules are my golden rules, all right? My golden rules. I don't know which one is more important, but I know they are very, very important when you're writing anything. Now, I'll just say them again because this can get hammered into your head because this is essentially a class. And I guess, I don't know, forget about it. So rule number one is writing follows language. That means writing comes after language, therefore it should mimic it. All right. The second rule is grammar serves meaning. That means that if somebody does not understand what you're talking about and you have perfect grammar, you need to change how you're writing it so the person can understand what you're talking about. And you certainly can have perfect grammar and have people not understand what you're talking about. But that flows back into that first rule of writing follows language. So if you don't take anything away, or if you want to forget about these rules, because I believe there are 14, and this is rule number 3 this week, if you want to forget about these rules, just remember that writing follows language. It should sound natural. It should sound like someone talking. Almost every single person I've ever met in my life is pretty good at talking. Like, even kids are really good at talking, but they can't write. So if you try to mimic that talking that you're able to do naturally, you're probably going to be all right. Also, the grammar serves meaning. Just because it is a rule doesn't mean it necessarily follows the language. Just because it is a rule and you have perfect grammar doesn't mean you're understood. So if you remember those 2 rules and you want to forget everything else and you want to abandon me completely, because that's what you're doing, if you want to do that, then just remember those 2 rules and forget about everything else. The next set of rules, I believe there's 3 of them, but these are the silver rules. All right, and I will. The golden rules are writing follows language, grammar serves meaning. The first silver rule, rule number 3, is people have short memories. All right, and I think, and this is a pretty important rule too, and this is something that I think you can apply to pretty much every single writing situation. You can have this in the back of your mind, and it can always help you because it connects to that rule beforehand. This connects to that idea of grammar serving meaning because it goes toward meaning, and I'll explain that in a second. So rule number 3, people have short memories. This is a silver rule. The first 2 rules are golden rules. Those are everything else, as I said last week, filter everything else through those other rules. It's kind of like math. You're building off of the things you learned last time. So here is an experiment. We'll start out with this, then I'll get into the rule eventually. But I want this foundation so you understand it. If you don't know, if you want to learn something and learn something well, try to understand it from multiple different facets and try to not just understand this individual idea in isolation. Try to understand it as a network of ideas and a system, and you'll understand it better. That is actually the human brain. So if you try to remember a specific date of something, so it goes back to the history test of middle school, high school, and they're like, oh, you should remember this exact date. Well, first of all, that exact date isn't going to do you a lot of good in the long run in your life, but you're not going to be able to remember it as well as a complex explanation of events, of what's going on, because the events, first of all, it's usually in story format, and second of all, there's more than one thing to connect to it, and because you have more than one thing, your brain, or how your brain works, bounces from one to the other, and it kind of connects all those things together. So the human brain doesn't really code, if you want to call it that, code things in isolation. It codes things as a network. And if you look at the human brain, it's a network of neurons. So, all right. So here's an experiment. Or here's something to think about. And if you don't have experience with this, I encourage you to take a language course, because you're bound to run into mathematics in a language course. So I know several people who will listen to this who will understand exactly what I'm talking about, and they're probably better at this than me because I'm not as good at the language. But if you have ever taken a language course, or if you remember this in the future, when you are taking a language course and you're a beginner, or even if you're not a beginner, try translating something from that language to your native language and doing math at the exact same time. So, for example, how hard do you think it would be, or I guess it's not really an example, how hard do you think it would be if I gave you 30 seconds and I put something, and you have knowledge of the language, it's just not your first language. I put, and you're a beginner, you're not fluent in the language. That is important too. I put this text, and it's a word problem. It's a word problem in a different language. And I'm like, you have 30 seconds to translate it and then solve the word problem. Now, most people would have trouble doing that. Actually, I'm pretty sure that every single person would have trouble doing that because they're they have time constraints. And if they're a beginner at the language, they have to do, there's multiple things they're trying to do. They're trying to translate, which is a difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of your attention. You have to put a lot of pieces together, and mathematics is also complex too. There's a lot of different pieces. There's a lot of different things you need to know, and you're trying to do them at once. Now, even if you can do this, even if you are fairly good at a language, you're intermediate, maybe you are fluent, it's probably harder it's probably harder to do it than just if you are reading a math problem, a word problem for math in your own language. The question, why does that happen? So the reason why that happens is because, and I've talked about this in the past. I had an episode, it's called Plus or Minus 2, and the episode deals with the memory of people and how they only can hold so much in their memory at a specific time, and scientists found out it's 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. But I'm going to actually go at it from a different direction, so I'm not just going to repeat myself. So what we call this when you're working on something is working memory, right? Actually, I don't call it. I didn't coin this term. I can't remember who coined this term, actually. So your memory. So you can think of your memory like this. Now, there's different types of memory. So working memory, there's long-term memory that kind of comes to you, and you can use that. It's your memory that it's triggered by a smell. It's triggered by whatever. And that's different than this. So there's that long-term memory, and I think most people understand. Just think of long-term memory as, we're going to put this in a filing cabinet, and then we're going to retrieve it later. That's a bit simplified, but it's a good start to understand it. Working memory is more like juggling. Okay. The reason why working memory is more like juggling is because to juggle, you have to be constantly attending to the things you're juggling. Now, if we think about complex problems, so if we think about translating something, working memory, and when you're translating something from a different language, especially if you're a beginner, it's kind of like solving a Rubik's Cube. Okay? Does that make sense? And if I suddenly have to solve that, and I have to I have to translate and solve the math problem, it's like juggling 2 Rubik's Cubes and solving them at the same time, if that makes sense. So 1 cube is manageable, and there is a kid who juggles and solves Rubik's Cubes, but most people aren't going to be able to do that. They're going to find that to be really, really hard. So that's a good picture of what it is. It's not the exact thing, but it is a good picture of what it is. Another definition or another example, actual picture, it's not a word picture. Another actual picture of working memory is spinning plates. So what you do, and this makes a lot of sense to me too after you think of it. So you only can do so much stuff with your working memory, and so there's this thing in I guess probably with circuses. I'm not sure who does this actually. I've never ever seen it done in my life. I'm pretty sure where you have a pole and you spin a plate on the pole, right? You're spinning a plate on the pole, and then you get more plates spinning. And to hold something in your working memory, first of all, there's no such thing as multitasking as we understand it typically. What multitasking really is switching from one thing to another really quickly. And that makes sense with the plates. If you think about it, you start one plate spinning, you move to another, you get that one started. You got to move back to the first one, maybe you get a third one, and you've got to keep on attending to these different things. You've got to keep on doing that. All right, to hold them up. So I think spinning plates or juggling make a lot of sense because they're things that are complex, and you can do multiple things at once, but you're not focused on one thing. You're not focused on multiple things at a time. You're focused on one thing at a time, and you're moving back and forth between all those things at once. Okay, so now we're going to connect that to writing. So there's only a certain amount of stuff you can do at a single time. I actually think that you really only can do one thing and then you can switch. Okay, so we are really limited in our capacity to focus on something. The exception to that rule is when you're really, really good at something, you do it without thinking. So you can do multiple things at once. So there is a facet to our brains where you do something so much it becomes a habit, so you can do it without thinking. Juggling is one of those. Spinning plates probably becomes one of those. There's a lot of other things too. I would say that writing, if you write a lot, it eventually becomes one of those. Now the content of the writing, I think, is still something that really you need to focus on, but the actual act of writing is not. Like the actual physical act of writing is not. There's other things too. Driving can be one of these, which is probably not the best thing in the world, but you're a zombie, you're driving, it's okay. Now, if we connect that back to writing, when a person reads something, they start spinning a plate, right? They start spinning a plate, and they are looking for understanding when they start spinning that plate. And once they find understanding, they don't care about that plate anymore, which is okay. So writing is a linear thing. You don't understand writing So if I look at a piece of art, I understand everything. I maybe don't understand everything, but I experience it all at once. Writing is experienced in writing is experienced one piece at a time, if that makes sense. And what your brain does is it takes those pieces and it puts them together. And eventually, once you get to the meaning of the sentence, then your brain puts it together. It's like, okay, I'm done with this. And then you can let the plate crash because it's not important anymore. So working memory is short. So how this applies, this goes back to the idea that people have short memories. Now, I'm not talking about people having short, long-term memories. I think people remember things generally pretty far into the past, and there's other things associated with memory, like memories change after a certain amount of time, and when you remember them and recall them and stuff like that. But in terms of your working memory, in terms of the memory you deal with when you're reading, it's pretty short. It's not something that, if you are hyper intelligent, if you're super intelligent, you probably have the capability of stringing huge things together and holding them in your working memory. Okay, does that make sense? So there's different bits of information. I already talked about this before. And if you're really, really super smart, like really smart, you can start at one end and you can kind of hold that and keep that plate spinning. You can keep 50 plates spinning, but eventually your memory is going to wear out and wind down. But most of us, we don't have a huge long memory. And even those people who have that huge memory, when I think of someone with an extremely long memory, I think of chess grandmasters, because chess grandmasters have to string together tons and tons and tons of information to arrive at a result, right? So that's who I kind of think. But for most people, and even for them, they probably don't want to read something and have to string together this huge thing of information and hold it in their minds before they understand something, okay? So we've got to create writing that takes into account people's short working memory, okay? So we could do this. Now, one way not to do this is have a lot of modifiers before nouns or verbs. So a modifier, adjective. If we write something and it has about 56 things in front of it, we're not going to remember what those different things are. All right, we're not going to actually fully take that into our minds. We're probably just going to be like, oh, that doesn't really matter. You can actually create sentences that are really, really long. You can create sentences that are long that take into account this idea. But in a lot of cases, or I think in a lot of cases with a lot of people, they create sentences. So they have a sentence that starts, right? And the sentence, it's like, it's talking about an elephant. And then it's like the elephant threw the umbrella into the crowd, all right? So they start with that. They start with this idea of the elephant throwing the umbrella into the crowd. Now, we can make that sentence more difficult if we add the elephant, despite having no history of violence, threw an umbrella into the crowd. Now, what we've got to do in that situation is we've got to go, oh, the elephant, and I've got to start that elephant plate spinning, right? I've got to start that elephant plate spinning, and I've got to keep it spinning until the end of that sentence, okay? Or I could add some more to the middle of that sentence and make it even worse. Despite having no history of the elephant, despite having no history of violence, at the end of that next evening, just before the sunset, threw an umbrella into the crowd. What happens is, if you make that long enough and you have enough information between that subject and verb, or if you make what happens in that situation, I'll get on to the next thing I almost talked over myself with. What happens in that situation is people have to remember the elephant at the end. They have to remember that what's going on in the main sentence, even as we're adding those modifiers in between stuff. So that really doesn't work, because you're forcing people to take more mental energy to focus on what you're reading, what they're reading. And especially in creative writing, the goal of your creative writing is to make people think that they're not even reading it at all. It's just something they're thinking almost. So if you're running into creative writing and it's like, oh man, this is tough to read, I think the creative writer isn't doing the job that he or she is supposed to be doing. I think that's the exact opposite thing that he or she is supposed to be doing. In some cases, you can't get past writing that is kind of a strain on people. But at the same time, because there's like legalese and there's different writing for different areas, but at the same time, if you are in those areas, I think you certainly, or I'm not sure, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor. If you're in areas that require more technical writing, I believe you're still capable of taking ideas and shortening them up and making it so people can actually understand it and not adding tons and tons and tons of things into it. Now, the same thing happens if you add tons of modifiers. The same thing happens if you add tons of modifiers at the beginning of a sentence too. If I have 5 things, if I have 5 clauses going on at the beginning of a sentence, that's not going to work as well because people are going to forget what's going on. Or if I do it at the end of a sentence too, people are going to forget what's going on. People aren't going to remember that information. Now, how do we get past this? Because if you read my writing, you'll see, well, maybe I'm not the best example of this. If you read my writing, you'll be like, well, Dan, you do this. You have long sentences and you have a lot of stuff going on. And one thing that actually people don't understand with writing is that repetition is actually a really good thing in some cases. Not all cases, but in some cases, repetition is your friend. In other cases, you need it to have variety. It's actually a very big mix because in actual speech, we're going back to our first, in actual speech, in real language, there's repetition in language. That's a good thing. If you think back to speeches, now this is kind of a tangent. If you think back to speeches that are really impactful throughout history, you're going to see repetition in those speeches because repetition is a part of language because it emphasizes things. In the same way, if we take that idea, well, not the emphasis, but if we take repetition from language, what it does in writing, it not only emphasizes something, but it also creates a through line through different ideas. So I can be talking about multiple different ideas, but I can bring them together with repetition. And what that also does is it makes it so that the person doesn't have to expend as much energy thinking. If I have repetition, they're like, oh, I know what to expect. I know what's going on. I know what's going on. I know what's going on. We've already seen this before. All I have to do is kind of apply this one variation on it, and then eventually you're going to get to the variations and the changes in your writing, which will make your writing better as well. So that's a little side note. Repetition isn't actually bad in writing. I actually almost always run, if I put my writing into one of those things, they're always like, oh, you shouldn't repeat these things. And then I read my writing, I'm like, sounds just fine. Read it out loud. I read it out loud. But I read it and I'm like, well, it's an algorithm, and it's like, well, these are the things that make good writing. And repetition actually makes good writing if it's not the only thing you're doing. There's this it's kind of a meme, I guess now, but it's a sentence, or it's someone writing. It's like, oh, if you have sentences with the same exact number of words, it gets really boring. But then you start to add more words, you start to add variety, and then it starts to get better. I think it's good writing. Eventually it is good writing. It does flow well. I think it goes beyond the point. I think that there is variation in writing, but the variation in writing only goes so far as the variation in language. And I think that you can go too far with the variation in writing. One way you can do this is constantly changing your words that you're using, the terms. If you're talking about love and suddenly you talk about passion and you talk about whatever else you could use as a word for love, I don't really know that many words for love. If you're talking about love in a paragraph and you suddenly switch what word you're using, people are like, wait, are you using passion or love? And I used to do this more, and I've kind of gotten out of that. So it's like, okay, I want variation in how I write, but at the same time, if I have too much variation, it isn't held together. There is cohesion. I need it to be cohesive, and in some cases, I need to repeat almost the exact same sentence to create that cohesion or to create a point. But that's just outside of the realm. But when you're going through this, remember, okay, if you're reading it, this is why I think it's good to set something down for a while and come back to read it and read it out loud. If you're reading something you've written, you're like, whoa, I don't know what's going on because there's way too much stuff here, then you should probably break some stuff apart and stuff like that. Or you should change it so that it's not as difficult to read. You certainly can have, I believe that you can have very, very long sentences that are grammatically correct, that follow the pattern of giving people pieces at a time rather than a huge swath of information. But what you need to do is you need to create phrases. You create smaller phrases that someone can spin. They spin it for a second. They're like, all right, I've got that. They move on to the next phrase. And that's kind of how it works. Okay. So third rule, my third rule is people have short memories, because if you take that into account with these other two, if you say, oh, writing follows language, look at language, look at how language works. All right, grammar serves meaning. Okay, if my grammar, you can certainly have, this goes back to that as well, you can have a perfectly grammatical sentence, and you can have it really long, or you can have it have too much information, and it doesn't get your point across, right? These all flow together. Let me see. Am I at the point where I was thinking? So, where am I? So yeah, so people need to be able to hold the things in their memory. If you have tons and tons of stuff, this is why I think people who aren't teachers, because I think teachers actually break things apart so people can understand them in smaller bits, but people who are trying to teach who aren't used to teaching, or people who are trying to give out information, they flood you with information. It's like people can only deal with so much information at a time. You've got to make it really simple. You've got to make it not necessarily simple, but pieces, small pieces at a time. So think about that when you're writing. Instead of just dropping stuff on people, give them pieces. And remember that they only can remember a certain amount at a time, that they only can kind of recognize. So your vision, you don't have a lot of vision that's really clear. Does that make sense? A lot of your vision is peripheral, which means that you only have a specific area that you can focus on at a time. And I think that's the same thing with the human brain. You can only focus on a specific amount at a time. Therefore, you've got to be able to go and focus on that amount, understand, you got to be able to focus on that sentence, understand it, move on to the next thing. If it's too long, you can't focus on it and understand it. Okay. So, I guess I had some more notes here, but I kind of already talked to my notes. Yeah, but if all else fails and you're like, well, Dan, this really doesn't help me, all you have to do is go back to those first two rules: writing follows language, grammar serves meaning. And you, especially the first one, if you're like, I don't know how to do this, well, think about how you would talk. Think about how you would talk, and you'd be like, well, I wouldn't have this huge sentence when I talk. Why would I have it in my writing? And then switch it up so it's actually how someone would talk. Now, some people are capable of putting together huge sentences when they talk. But then if you're still in doubt, run it past somebody else who can read it out loud for you and be like, hey, this doesn't make any sense because it's way too much information. Making myself tired. All right, logical fallacy of the week. We are on to that. So this logical fallacy is ipsa dixit, and it also is the bare assertion fallacy. That is the English term for it. What it is it's a claim presented as true without support. It's a claim presented as self-evidently true. Okay. So it could be the case that somebody says, they make a claim and they're an expert, and people are like, oh, that must be self-evidently true because they're an expert, therefore they're correct. Or it's just something people say and people automatically take it as something true. So that's actually a logical fallacy. And I'm going to actually put a little caveat. Caveat reminds me of caviar, and I'm not sure exactly how to say the word because I'm not sure how to say all the words. But with this, I think there are certain things that you cannot prove in life. I don't think it's if you say, hey, I believe this to be true, and you don't necessarily have an argument for it, I don't think that necessarily makes it a logical fallacy. But if you are presenting it as an argument, I think it makes it a logical fallacy. But I think that you can be honest with others and be honest with yourself and be like, hey, I believe this is true. I think one thing that you run into with this is the thing in the Declaration of Independence where it says all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Now that is a truism. They're saying, oh, this is self-evident. So in the Declaration, they're like, these truths are self-evident. So they are technically presenting a truism. At the same time, because they're saying, well, they're not, maybe not a truism, but they're presenting something as self-evident. They're saying these are things that we believe, And I think you can say, okay, I believe this and I believe it to be correct. And I think there are certain things that you cannot prove logically in life. At the same time, you should look at those and be like, okay, can I prove these logically or not? Are these things subject to logic? I don't know if human relations to one another are subject to logic. I don't know if those actions are. I'm not sure completely, to a certain degree, I guess. But at the same time, I think there are things, well, I would argue that there are things that go beyond the human experience, right? There are things, and that's a hard argument because I think there's a philosopher, and he says you can't think beyond your own thinking, which makes sense. We can only think we only can think a certain amount, which means there's things we can't think about, which means there's things we can't argue about. We don't have arguments for them, which means we have to be like, well, I think this is true, and I hope I'm correct, right? All right, so that is the end of the episode. As always, it is, gosh, I don't even know. It's October. I don't know what I'm doing for the end of the month. I don't know if I'm doing anything. I'm pretty sure the last episode of the month lands on Halloween. We'll see. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy. I hope you have a great rest of your week. This is How to Write Good.